Welcome to the Yale Center for British Art's online series, Artists in Conversation. I'm Molly Dotson, the Assistant Curator of Rare Books and Manuscripts at the Center. I'm delighted that you've joined us today for our program featuring artist and professor Eileen Hogan, who will be in conversation with Elisabeth Fairman, the Center's Chief Curator of Rare Books and Manuscripts. Before their conversation gets underway, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Please note this program will be recorded and live closed captioning will be available. Your cameras and audio will remain off throughout the program, and you will find your chat feature disabled as well. Instead, we invite you to use the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar, which is where we will gather your questions for Eileen. After the presentation, we will try to answer as many questions as time permits before we conclude at 1 o'clock. Thank you in advance for participating. And now it's my pleasure to hand over the program to Eileen and Elisabeth.
Thank you, Molly. We're so happy that you have all been able to join our conversation today, and it's a special thrill to have Eileen join us from London. The intention this afternoon is to introduce Eileen's work to those of you who are unfamiliar with it and revisit it for those of you who know it and love it, like we all do. We'd like to share some of our thoughts on the exhibition that we did together of Eileen's work last year at the Center. And I have to say that I've done a lot of exhibitions in my time there, but this is the one that I am most proud of, and I'm just so happy to revisit it today. We're going to touch upon the planning process, what went into it, what we left out, and find out what Eileen is willing to share about what she's learned about her work from focusing on so intently. And what we both gained from it, I think. So obviously we won't be able to touch upon everything this afternoon, but I can direct you to the wonderful book, Personal Geographies, that we published with Yale University Press last year to coincide with the exhibition of the same name, with essays by Eileen and others talking about her work, beautifully designed by Miko McGinty and gorgeously printed by Conti Tipo Color in Florence. And I think it demonstrates what a labor of love it was for all of us, including the essayists. So besides talking about her work that was in the exhibition and her experience with the Center and its incredible staff, we're going to delve into what Eileen is working on now and find out how the COVID crisis has affected her artistic practice. So first, before we start our slides and our discussion, I'd like to briefly introduce you to Eileen. She began her career in 1962 when she was 16 years old and enrolled at the Camberwell School of Arts and Crafts, as it was then known. Eileen went on to study at the Royal Academy Schools, the British School at Athens, and the Royal College of Art. She is currently Professor of Fine Art at the University of the Arts London and a trustee of the Royal Drawing School. Eileen has remained a steadfast figurative artist throughout her career, although, as we will confirm today, she constantly questions her practice. Two dominant subjects have emerged in her paintings in recent years: gardens, primarily enclosed green spaces, and portraiture. And we'll look at both today. And both are linked by memory. As she says, the whole idea of presence and absence runs through all my work. When I'm working on a series of pictures, the memory of the place is as important as the place itself. And memory is the word that I keep coming back to when thinking about Eileen's work. And I think we'll talk about that today a bit. Eileen returns to the same place, painting it over time, enclosed green spaces like Little Sparta, the garden created by Ian Hamilton Finlay in Scotland, the Chelsea Physic garden in London. Portraiture is equally important to her. She has sittings of the person over long periods, often while they are being recorded by an oral historian. The resulting portraits are insightful depictions of the sitters, captured as they narrate their lives, a pioneering approach that alters the dynamics of the encounter, as well as the resulting work. So I'm going to start our slideshow and be forewarned, I am in charge of advancing the slides, so please be patient. If something goes terribly wrong, we'll try to fix it. I totally know what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Eileen, can you see the slides?
I can, yes, great.
Good. So let's start with the first slide, which is, of course, the gate and the door to your studio, Pembroke Studios in London. And I must say, over the 3 years, I think, or 4 years, however long we worked on this show, I loved going through that gate and ringing the bell and taking a look at the camellia bush that was right there. It was honestly a magical moment for me, that transitional space that I think that you've also talked about. And you'd always have a cup of tea waiting and a cheese scone from Gail's.
Thanks, Elisabeth, for such a nice introduction, and hello to everybody. That studio, it's an amazing studio to have, and it's in Kensington. There are 12 studios around a courtyard and a garden, and they were purpose-built in about 1850. All the artists moved out when the area became real estate and developers moved in. So there aren't a huge number of artists left, so I'm very lucky. And in fact, before me, it was occupied by the artist Leonard Rosserman, who taught me at the Royal College when I was a student there. And he'd had it for about 40 years, so there's lots of history there. I mean, a painter I like very much, Michael Andrews, had the studio next door in the 60s. So that's very resonant for me as well.
And how long have you painted there?
7 years, but hopefully for a lot longer.
Right. I hope so. So I think, as I said, we worked on this show for about 3 years. This is a photo taken at the height of one of our discussions, I think. And we worked very carefully on the narrative. And I think that's one of the things that we became very self-conscious about, the documentation of it, in case we needed to go back and rethink anything. So we saved all the spreadsheets, all the resizings. You were making up titles on the spot because it was clear that your method of making titles for paintings is not as helpful to registrars across the world. And so that was kind of fun. And then we recorded some sound when people visited the studio. We took some video, we took lots of photos in case we changed our mind and had to take a step back. So I think from the very first, we were thinking of it sort of as an archival project in some ways, which was not something that I started out thinking.
I mean, for me, what that photograph reminds me of is that working so closely with you, Elisabeth, and we worked for nearly 3 years on this, meant a very detailed and focused analysis of my work. And it made me see my work in a different way, actually. That I've always felt slightly embarrassed about being a figurative painter, being both figurative and a painter, when it's been very, very unfashionable. But I think somehow all this kind of your rigor and your scholarship, it made me feel that, or maybe see that it's possible to say something serious using conventional methods. And also, but it's actually being a figurative painter so consistently is rather a radical thing and not conventional. But I think most of all, it made me feel very comfortable in my artistic skin. So a very influential period on me and on my work. It's rather rare, really. I mean, because, I've had a lot of art exhibitions in commercial galleries and some museums, and you work very hard for a couple of years on your own in the studio. It gets hung and it's up for a couple of weeks, and then it was a very, very different experience.
So we mentioned the book, and we selected the essay writers very carefully, each of them having the goal to focus on one aspect of your work. And we asked Duncan Robinson, who was former director of the Yale Center for British Art, went on to be the director of the Fitzwilliam, and a brilliant art historian, who has a great interest in Ian Hamilton Finlay, Little Sparta, and your work. So we asked him to write the essay looking at your career broadly. And we found that he focused on your earlier self, material that we had been pulling and thinking about putting in the exhibition. But I think this photo, when we were looking for slides for this conversation, I don't know that I'd shown you this photograph before, and I think it was a good moment for us to rethink what we were doing that day.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I hadn't seen that before, and it's extraordinary because Duncan honed in on two paintings which I painted when I was 16. And I thought my interest in portraits was relatively recent, but the woman in the portrait was a model in the cast room at Camberwell in itself quite rare because cast rooms were all chucked out by art schools in the 60s. And models, we were taught a very kind of a way of drawing, which, which was called the kind of Euston Road school of drawing, which is very much to do with measuring and looking at a series of related shapes. And models weren't really considered as people, but just as shapes. And yet here I am, painting a face with recognisable features. And the little landscape is a tiny little park near the college, and it's enclosed. And enclosures continue to interest me. And as do the dynamics of gardens, somewhere to work, somewhere to play. So that's an extraordinary image for me, and very nice to see Duncan's nicely ironed shirts in his arm.
What I love about it is it has your two strands of your work, portraiture, enclosed gardens. The sketchbook at the back is an early sketchbook of yours focused on trees. I mean, all the things that you did at 16, you're still doing. I think that is incredible. And I just wanted to touch upon our organizational plans. We had thought we would start with this early work and do something chronological. And Duncan came in and that's, I don't know if it's this studio visit or another one, but he encouraged us to think differently about it and to suggest that we start with your garden paintings, what you are working on now, and end with them. And it just turned us all upside down, but it was a really good moment, I think. That moment that you realize you have to sometimes throw everything out and start again and just have a fresh view.
Yeah, you were really good at that.
Now here we see Sarah Victoria Turner of the Paul Mellon Centre in London, and she's done a lot of work recently on portraiture and oral history. So we asked her to write an essay on your portraiture, and I think she came up with some really wonderful new thoughts, especially that you paint portraits of places as well as people.
Yeah, she pointed that out in relationship to Ian Hamilton Finlay, that somehow painting the place, painting the garden, little Sparta, I needed to do that before I started actually painting him, and he would disappear and appear and talk. And so, but she also made me understand in relationship to portraits, that observing and painting someone while they're being recorded is not only a way of understanding them, but it also disrupts the formalities and conventions of portraiture, which I hadn't thought before.
So we think, I mean, you've talked about it so eloquently in your essay and other places, but you can capture the nuances of their expressions as they tell their story.
Yes, it's
to the oral historian.
Yeah. It's like breaking code almost. Watching somebody for a long time and trying to find a look that is authentic, and then watching the changes in mood. And I tend to work in quite an unfinished way, which we'll look at later on. But I like that because I'm painting in the present, and the sitter is talking about the past, and the painting will be seen in the future. And I think the unfinished quality represents that. And I painted Ian at Little Sparta, actually, when he was being recorded by Cathy Courtney, the writer and oral historian, in his conservatory. So that was the beginning of that kind of relationship. And Little Sparta had an enormous effect on me. I mean, it's an enclosed garden, but by moors, not by London streets. It's a poet's garden. And in relationship to Ian's work, I mean, my paintings have almost nothing to do with his artworks. But what my work is about is my reaction to him and the garden. So it's an emotional response. And
I think this painting on the right is just superb, and I'm very happy that it's in the center's collections. We have it up very often.
What you were saying before about an archive, really. I mean, I was aware. I kept sketchbooks. I don't know. Am I preempting your next question?
No. I think we wanted to talk about the importance of sketchbooks. And how, to me, it seemed that the Little Sparta sketchbooks changed something. I mean, you always did do sketchbooks, keep sketchbooks. We just saw one in the previous slide of the trees. But something happened at Little Sparta.
Well, I think partly because it was so far out of London, and I'm a real Londoner, so kind of going into the wilds of Scotland was quite an enormous experience for me. And the farm was originally called Stony Path. And my God, that's, you know why, if you go there, because you go up a very steep stony path surrounded by fields and cows. So I think I became more, but the sketchbooks became more of an archive for me. And somehow that's what changed. They were representing my ideas, my responses to the plays. I jotted a lot of things down. I made lists. And so you're quite right. I think they did change a little bit. I became more aware of them, actually. I've been a bit unconscious about them before.
So let's move on and talk about the installation of the exhibition at the center. As it's probably clear now, we discussed absolutely every detail of the hang. We measured everything 16 times to make sure that everything would fit. We felt it was very important, as we always do, doing exhibitions at the center, to do a very careful narrative. The story that we wanted the visitors to understand as they walk through, to understand completely why something was hung next to something else. So we knew there would be things to discuss when you were able to come to the center, but a lot of the work had been done on paper using our model box in your studio. So when you arrived a week before the exhibition opened, we knew that the major complications had been worked out. We weren't going to redo the narrative. We weren't going to all of a sudden go back to doing it chronologically. But what happened when you came in and you saw all these incredible people putting your works up?
Well, it was fantastic. It was such an extraordinary team. And because the work looked pretty wonderful up the way it had been hung, there wasn't actually very much to do in terms of rehanging, although we did a tiny bit. But I really got to know everybody quite well. I mean, there's Jessica, the conservationist, but particularly the installation team. They're all artists, actually, and had such a interesting group of people who had very different perspectives on my work. And so that was quite extraordinary. And then are you going to tell the story about Kyle and the portrait?
The next slide. Yes, we better move on. Right, got it. Okay, so we had this wonderful moment. So here's in the middle illustration shows the exhibition as you would see walking in, and Kyle Kierson, one of the installation team, noticed that in the background of your self-portrait in your studio is a painting that is clearly Ian Hamilton Finlay, that you see it as a glimpse in the bay, sort of in the far ground. And he asked if we had done that on purpose, and we hadn't. So it was just this wonderful serendipitous moment. But as I was staring at the painting, I realized it was not what I was familiar with. So at some point, you had painted Ian Hamilton Finlay behind you as you're standing there, so that if you look at the book, you see the self-portrait as it is on the right here. So that shook me, that an artist can actually take their own work and change it. Forget to tell me, but that's fine. We got over it. But I thought that was kind of wonderful that you didn't even think to mention it.
Well, it wasn't that I was keeping it from you, but I often take things out and put things back in my paintings. And that's one of the reasons I use wax. I put layers of wax in between the oil paint. And there are traces of what was left before. And it's so much part of my practice. I don't even notice when I've done it, really. Things come and go. So I really apologize about that.
No, it's fine. I think I had to confess to the press when we did our press preview that the images that they had in their packet were not the same ones. So we had to go around and get our installation photographer, Richard Caspol, to do a quick photo of it.
I think the next slide, there's Kyle and Rachel. And I mean, Kyle was actually installing a piece of his work at Art Space in New Haven, where he's on the board. And I went and saw that with him. We had some absolutely memorable conversations. Rachel was about to have an exhibition, which sadly I didn't get to see, but I saw photographs of the work. And Jonathan on the right, who was, as well as being an intern, was studying criminal justice in New Haven. And he was taught so well about the contested nature of green spaces in New Haven. And then we haven't got a photograph of Rick Johnson, who's a filmmaker and musician and passionate about the Louis Kahn building, which I am as well. So it was such an interesting group of people to get to know. I mean, I really value it. So I hope if any of you listen, thank you very, very much. It was very important to me, those conversations.
I think it's such an opportunity when the artist comes to the center and spends as much time with us as you did. It's an incredible experience, and I think one that we all treasure. And of course, after it opened, you were able to stay on for a bit, and I think you actually became like a rock star. You got caught up in these spontaneous tours. I think you're in the corner there on the left, way in the back. And people just glommed onto you. And I remember walking around New Haven with you, and people would come up and say, "Oh, Eileen, you're the artist. I would love to have, like to give you my opinion on your work." It's just, seemed to me probably an unusual situation. If you have an exhibition in London, if someone came up to you and started talking to you, you might not have that same response.
Absolutely not.
Was it unusual, do you think, this interaction you had with the public?
Well, it was unique, actually. Totally unique. I mean, I did feel like a rock star. It was extraordinary. And I enjoyed it, which was amazing, because I always think of myself as being very reserved. But people were so enthusiastic, actually. And it did feel like a sustained critique of my work. I mean, it was almost like we were talking before, we started, it was almost like being a student again, really, when you actually just spend all your time talking about your work and thinking about it. And so, and we did so many tours with the docents, the members, staff, the public. So it was really amazing.
That's great. So let's talk about the unusual opportunities that arose having Kathy Courtney, who's this incredibly brilliant and experienced oral historian, at the center at the same time.
Yes, she actually recorded. She works in National Life Stories, and she recorded a cross-section of the staff talking about my work actually in the exhibition. And one of the reasons that we were doing this, we talked earlier on about documentation. As part of my university work, I have to contribute to the REF, Research Excellence Framework, which is a way of assessing the quality of research in UK universities. And exhibitions and curatorship are recognised as research, but evidence can be very hard to assemble because the process is not very often not documented in huge detail. And exhibitions are usually very temporary. So that was the kind of one of the motivations behind it. But I also felt really that many of the skills of everyone involved are invisible to a wider audience and so often slip through the net. So it was an extraordinary opportunity to capture these voices. And that's how we're going to lead on to the film, I think, a little film that we made using all this material. And
you have this incredible colleague, tell us about Wendy. Yeah.
Wendy directed and edited and put together all this collage of different sorts of material, using, for instance, a walkthrough video that Ronnie Rice did, and the installation shots and Kathy's recordings. And we hadn't planned to make a film, so everything was kind of had to be patched together in a way. And it was partly everyone was very enthusiastic about doing it, and she's done a fabulous job, I think. That's
great. Okay, so now a bit of a surprise.
Wendy, you're
yeah, I hope Wendy's listening. Wendy, you are amazing. Thank you. We're going to actually show the film now. This is where you can see my technical expertise fall apart, but we're going to try it. It's 7 minutes, and then we're going to come back.
Eileen's surfaces, I think, are something that I've really enjoyed. They have this amazing velvety quality.
That kind of peaceful solitude is what I relate to most.
I was particularly intrigued by the repetition within certain works. There were a number of iterations of a particular subject.
One of the things that stands out to me is that people say that the sprinklers are so realistic they can almost hear it.
There's that perfect moment of light, sound, movement, and that moment becomes that transcendent moment.
We've just had a lot of people spending a huge amount of time in the space. People are not just zooming through, and I think that's what's interesting.
I think of works of art as making a difference to the way that one sees the world. And I think the exhibition at the centre made a difference to the way that I see my work. And there are a lot of contributing factors to that. The amount of planning that went into it, the fact that Elisabeth Fairman, the curator, came to London so many times and we discussed so many aspects of my work, and that she brought a very fresh vision to it and to the exhibition.
So part of the organization of the exhibition meant that we had to think very carefully about how to tell the story of her work and her career and see how we were going to tell her story in the narrative that's proscribed by our architecture. When I do an exhibition, I do it on paper, and I think about it and I dream about it, and it has never occurs to me to do a three-dimensional model. But Eileen had a student who wanted to do a special model box of the exhibition when it was just so easy to pick a little painting off the second bay and stick it in the first bay and think, oh, that actually works. What happened over the course of time was we really sort of switched our narrative. We were starting out thinking chronologically, and in the end, we didn't do it at all. We'd start with garden pictures and we'd end with garden pictures. And in the middle, we would do the enclosed gardens, which would segue nicely from the Garden Museum project, and then the core focusing on portraiture and that interest that she had in oral history. The model box helped us think through that, honestly, which if I was doing it all on flat paper, I don't think we would have made that leap.
I had to interrogate myself about my work in a way I hadn't before, in particular about why I was a figurative artist, why I was a painter when it's not been a very acceptable thing to be in the art world. And the conclusion that I came was that it's an eccentric thing to be, but I think only the people who have remained painters during the period when it was unfashionable, and it's not so much now, had to really, really want to do it. In some ways, it was more of a radical thing to do than a conventional thing to do. The planning of the exhibition, and Elisabeth made me very aware of my very well-defined process.
The sketchbooks are the spine of her work, and I think to give visitors the opportunity to see how an artist thinks is always what I'm after.
I hadn't thought about the sketchbooks being so important. I knew they were vital for how I worked, drawing in my sketchbook initially to find out what interests me, drawing from memory to find out what matters to me, getting everything in the studio, including photographs, working out what the composition will be, doing a number of quite finished studies, and then medium-sized pieces and then larger pieces. So there's a kind of progression. But the sketchbook slip in and out of all those stages. So in some ways there are quite often quite finished paintings in the sketchbook. And I hadn't really thought about that. I hadn't seen them in a way as a work of art in themselves. The designer of the book was involved at very early stages of the thinking about the book and was conceptually very clear and calm and made contributions all the way through.
Elisabeth and Eileen worked together to look through materials, but I was given an access point at different moments to think about how we could put together all these different kinds of material into a single book and have it really express Eileen's practice as an artist.
The installation of the exhibition is the intersection between the curatorship and the actual work itself. Elisabeth Fairman, we spent several years working on the exhibition in the book, has been very thoughtful and meticulous and rigorous. But I witnessed the installation team being equally as thoughtful and creative and thinking about my work. I was so impressed with the way they actually thought and talked about my work as well. So the combination of those two things seemed to me to be quite remarkable.
But one of the things we kept talking about was like how much we really liked being in the space and how much we really liked the sort of mindfulness of this artwork. And all of a sudden we all had the same sort of idea that what was really great about this show was that it was pretty, it was beautiful. And that idea of what beautiful was and how we interpreted that idea of beauty. Louis Kahn is a major presence in everything we do. I think Eileen's artwork is very sympathetic to the building. The fact that Eileen's work is being shown on natural linen, the wool carpets, believe it or not, play an important part in how this art is perceived in this space. it's not competing with Louis Kahn, it's actually complementing Louis Kahn.
This exhibition feels like a work of art to me, as well as being about my art, and it's got something to do with the architecture and the building, Louis Kahn's building, to do with the luminosity of the building and the grid of the building, and the subtlety of materials and colours within it has made it, for me, the most extraordinary place to see my work.
I love that film. I don't know if it makes everybody else tear up. I get a little emotional. And thank you, Wendy, for doing such a lovely job. So we'd like to actually turn to the COVID crisis and look at your work and how it's changed since the beginning of the lockdown in March. And I know you've been working from memory of certain places like Little Sparta and Chelsea Physic Garden, enclosed green spaces that have always been touchstones for you, and which we have already spoken about it. What else about these places?
Both these gardens made me realise that they had actually become part of my DNA, so they exist in my head. And I've painted them both again, actually, since I've been able to return to my studio. So that was a kind of, important aspect of my work then.
So thinking about Chelsea Physic Garden, I know you've been there in all seasons. I so admired you in your raincoat. I think you said you had to get to the garden early on so that the gardener hadn't actually shifted the sprinklers yet. And I remember you said, and we've talked about it earlier today, but also Rick touches upon it, I think, in the film, that you had a number of good conversations with Rick Johnson, our head of installation, about the sprinkler and its relation to music. And we know that music is very important to you. But did your conversation with Rick reveal anything new, do you think?
Oh, yes, it did really. I mean, watering at the painting on the right was in the exhibition, so it's not a new painting, but watering at the Chelsea Physic Garden was carefully timed. So the sprinklers were moved at the same time every day. And the way people, visitors, negotiated the garden was influenced by the sprinklers because they didn't want to get wet, but I was wearing my protective clothing. And routine matters to me in painting. And Rick picked up on this, really. He talked about Ravi Shankar and morning chants and related it to the sound of the sprinkler, the click, 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 and the silence. And silence is something that I strive for in my paintings.
And in fact, there was a lot of silence in London from March and in April.
Yeah. Well, two big changes for me were I couldn't go to the studio. We weren't. London was a hotspot, and we were asked not to make journeys unless we absolutely had to. And I had a little space at home in my office, so I worked there, which was very small. So the scale of my paintings changed. And the other big thing was that I couldn't draw. I couldn't go and draw outside, and so I was very much an artist in residence at home. And I had a painting, an exhibition, I don't know, about 15 years ago at the Fine Arts Society called 4 Squares. And there were 4 squares that were part of my walk to my then studio, Manchester, Bryanston, Montague, and Portman, and this is Manchester Square. But what was quite extraordinary is that there was no traffic and there were no parked cars. And so it was very much like, it felt like 18th century London. And it was stunning weather. I found I looked upwards a lot. And also became very much aware of the architecture. I mean, all the squares were bomb damaged in the Second World War. And so they have much later buildings as well as the 18th century buildings. And then somehow it all became much more heightened. And it was a very frightening time, and it is frightening now, but for different reasons. And so everyone was doing that. We were allowed to do a 1 hour walk a day, and we were all doing our walks and doing odd zigzaggy walks because trying to avoid each other. But at the same time, people were friendly and we were saying hello. And it never happens in London. So quite an extraordinary period.
And then at least spring came along.
It was
and I was wondering about this picture. I mean, clearly you've always used your camera at various times, but did your use of the camera in photography change when you were so restricted by your time outside?
Yes, well, actually, it didn't exactly change, but I became aware of it much more, really. I mean, it was spectacularly beautiful, and the blossom was, in a way, quite relentless and quite sad, as well as being extraordinary. And I use photography as part of my practice, but very much when I know what I'm doing. And I thought I would take photographs at an earlier stage, but it wasn't helpful to me because it's a blink, it's a mechanical blink and click, rather than looking for a long period, which includes so much more. And when I draw, things happen that I don't anticipate. And so actually memory became, you mentioned memory earlier, became even more important. For instance, I was very surprised by the things I couldn't remember when I got home about what I'd just seen. But actually, if it couldn't be remembered, then it didn't have to be remembered. And so that was actually quite useful, really.
And so then you were able to discover what was important to you by what you remembered, which is obvious. But I love this new sketchbook with Manchester Square paired with an earlier sketchbook of your time in Kew Gardens. I love the use of your color palette as you're capturing the range. So you must have had to just remember this great haze of pink blossom.
Yes, I think what I became very aware of is if my pencil sort of sees things in a different way to my eyes. I don't quite know what I'm going to draw. And also, I don't really care what the drawings look like in my sketchbook. I can experiment and not really be serious. So, that was, my work didn't change, but I just became aware of different processes. I was working much smaller, and there was a kind of, with very small marks, so there was sort of intensity. I did a series of the blossom paintings. I mean, talk about being worried about being figurative and painting, but painting blossom, couldn't be more banal, really, but it was so extraordinary. And again, this was to do with looking up. In my previous paintings of the squares, I've been much more interested in the long view, the idea of the inside, outside. So that actually was a change.
This is a beautiful piece, and it clearly shows what matters to you.
Yes, it was kind of different stages of the blossom, really, sort of transparent layers and the transition to the full colour. And then the blossom, the dark, there was a kind of dance of when the blossom started to fall, and then a sense of decay, really.
I'm very conscious of time, but I don't want to neglect this really wonderful strand of your work, portraiture. So up to now, we focused on your interest in gardens, but of course, it's really interesting to think about your recent commission you're working on still of Alan Rusbridger. How did this come about?
It was a commission from Lady Margaret Hall, one of the Oxbridge colleges, where Alan is principal. And Alan before that was editor-in-chief at the Guardian newspaper. Had a highly influential role in investigative journalism. And he was quite a hero to a lot of people. And I'm a huge admirer too. So I said yes straight away, not realising quite what an odd genre the tradition of painting portraits for Oxford colleges is. Actually, Lady Margaret Hall was a woman-only college, so at least the portraits there aren't all of men. So I started in December last year, and Kathy recorded, Alan did a life story recording with him while I painted him. And we started in his office in the college, and I painted a head at each session. And so Alan is answering questions. talking to Kathy, not to me. So the awkwardness of looking and being looked at is alleviated. And, the pauses are sometimes as important as the words, and the nuances of delivery and changes in energy and mood. And slight changes in appearance from week to week. And so this is, again, I like the unfinished quality of story, of the studies, which reflects the unfolding nature of actually telling a story. And there's always more to be said. And the next slide shows you where it was going to be hung. And I thought, I planned to develop a larger painting, which was similar in format to the other paintings. And I thought perhaps something like this. I like the way Alan sat in his armchair, really. He's tall and he folds himself up rather like an umbrella. But then I really decided I very much wanted to reflect the oral history, because particularly as it happened over such an extraordinary period of political turmoil. And, that was even before COVID. And Kathy always starts with questions about current events. So given Alan's background, I was actually found myself listening to a remarkable commentary on, current events and all our political structures seem to be breaking down. So I tried out the idea of using the paintings of the heads from each sitting and framing 9 together. So I made a mock-up and tried it out in the dining hall to see how it looked, and there's Alan actually looking at it. And it seemed to work, so that's how we progressed.
But now?
Lockdown came, so I continued painting Alan. So Kathy and I were in our kitchen, where I am now, and Alan was in his shed in the garden, which he'd actually built himself, and not recently, but and they had a lively new puppy who joined in. He was called Nipper. That was his informal name, I think, and I think his name gives you a clue to his character. And then the last sitting was in his piano room. So far I've painted 7 that I like, and I've rejected 4, and very much looking forward to the next sitting.
It's brilliant. And I also think you're painting a portrait of William Kaelin, who is professor of medicine at Harvard and winner of the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2019. And his daughter, Catherine, was a Yale student, and in fact was a Bartels intern and a student guide. Can you quickly tell us how this portrait came about?
Yes, Catherine came to the exhibition in Yale, and she came there, and then she came to an exhibition in London, which was at Browse Darby, which showed some of the same work. And the family wanted a portrait of Bill to celebrate his winning the Nobel Prize. And Bill and Catherine came to the studio in London, on the way, and his son Trip, on the way to the Nobel Prize award ceremony in Sweden. And then we had, at another time, we had one face-to-face sitting with Kathy recording. And since then, it's been online. I mean, it's much harder than with Alan because I've only met Bill twice. So it's a bit of an unknown quantity, but it's been lovely getting to know him and Catherine.
Thank you for that. So we want to go back to your studio now as it is today. Tell us what you're working on. First, your self-portrait on the left. And I love the fact you're using that mirror.
That was Leonard's mirror, Leonard Rossman's. He's actually put in a hinged mirror, which I'd always thought was for his self-portraits. But actually he used it to have a long look at his paintings. Mm-hmm. And I found myself kind of each day getting glimpses of myself. So I drew in my sketchbook. And during lockdown, I started drawing. And again, when I could go back to the studio, that was one of the things I did. I started drawing the self-portrait. And the hair, I mean, I look at my hair, which is so long compared to now. And then I think of, actually, I should have said about Alan's portrait. I mean, he got shaggier and shaggier at each sitting. So I think I could call this series of portraits Watching Hair Grow. And the painting on the right is the Chelsea Physic garden again. And I think actually it's the same.
Yeah, so tell us more about what's changed. This is
yes. I mean, some people might say that, look, it's exactly the same. And in actual fact, rather as the portraits, when I'm looking for a kind of authentic look, once I find a spot that I want to work from or a moment, then that's what I paint more or less all the time. So this is actually a very wet and misty day in February 1970, and the plants, it was winter, so the plants had all been covered in silvery wrappings to protect them from the frost.
So you're revisiting your paintings, not the gardens.
Yes, memory, really. It's what your point, really.
And I think that's the word, again, that I said at the beginning, and it is the word that we keep thinking about it. And what do you have you thought about why you're so attracted to doing enclosed gardens? I mean, I don't want to get too deeply psychoanalytical here, but it's so interesting.
Well, I think my very dysfunctional childhood established quite a deep longing in me for an ordered and harmonious world. And I feel it was a feeling of striving for something out of reach. And gardens provide this for me, which became, I think, even more poignant in COVID. I think a lot of people looked to nature during that period. Again, I mentioned earlier, they have so many dynamics as a sanctuary. I mean, the Chelsea Physic garden is a working garden, and sometimes, a battle between nature and control. And I think what I've been thinking about now, and again, I've become more aware of it, is that what I hope is that my paintings lead to something quite abstract and an inwardness and a silence. And I think what is odd about talking about abstract is that I try to do this not through making abstract marks or even the combination of figurative and abstract marks, but through dense and figurative detail. So that's what I've been thinking about quite a lot.
It's beautiful. Thank you for sharing it at this point. Okay, I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions. And Molly's back to give us a hint about what they are attracting people's interest as they've watched.
Thank you both. There is quite a lot of interest and excitement and gratitude for you sharing your work, Eileen, today. You've already spoken about some of the repetitive and ritualistic aspects of your process, and I know that you've contributed a playlist to the Center's Spotify channel as well. Could you talk more about music in relation to your artistic practice?
Music is important in my studio life, but I would consider myself to be an eager listener rather than an expert. And what I've just described, which is aiming for something abstract through realism, I think is actually quite easier to grasp in music. In fact, I needed another conversation with Rick about this. And so I think fundamentally that I'm an abstract artist who is also 100% committed to realism, which is a kind of somehow makes more sense to me in music, and it's almost more difficult in terms of portraiture because the conflict is much more apparent there, which is maybe why the genre is so impossible now. Not the confrontation necessarily between realism and abstraction, but the conflict between the individuality and centrality of the artist in relationship to likeness. Matisse, I think, said something like a portrait is like a feud, and I think that's become more and more so currently. In that, is the artist more important than the sitter? I think the artist is generally is more important now. I'm talking off the top of my head. I might be talking rubbish. We should move on to the next question.
So you mentioned earlier on the difficulty in assigning titles to your work, and someone has asked about that. Could you elaborate a bit more?
Well, I became very aware about how difficult it is for curators, and in particular Elisabeth. And Elisabeth might want to add something about this. I mean, often a lot of artists use untitled. I wasn't doing that, but I work, in series. And so, for instance, the Chelsea Physic Garden, there might have been 10 or 15. And to make it even more complicated, I didn't just number them. I also wanted to capture that moment when this kind of striking the match moment when I saw something that I knew was going to become important. And so we started putting the dates in. I'm not sure, Elizabeth, I think that might have been your idea, and it was a really good idea, but it was incredibly complicated because it would say something like Chelsea Physic Garden, 2nd of February 2017, and then we'd actually have the date when it was done, which might have been 2019. Elizabeth, you want to add something to that?
Well, the importance of italics was never more important, I think. We were very careful not to italicize the date of the painting, but the last date before the comma in italics just confused everybody. But I think we're doing pretty well until you did different versions of that same date. Then it was Chelsea Physic Garden 1, 2nd February, 2019, 2020, or whatever. One is always thinking of the registrar. And so we wanted to be quite careful about packing up your work and unpacking it and installing it properly. So all of those details, it turns out, make a huge amount of difference. So we wouldn't oblige an artist to put a title on a work if they didn't want to. But thank you, Eileen, it helped us.
Well, I said at the time, I think it's a message for students, really. I mean, they start kind of numbering and making notes, really, and you think you're always going to remember, and then you never actually do. So
Documentation, archive,
yes,
process. Yeah,
I think keep an archive.
Materials. Yeah,
keep an archive of your work from very early days. It really matters.
Can I ask a question? Because I know that it was constantly on people's minds at the center. Could you talk more about your wax and what form is it, and when do you apply it?
Oh, okay. It's a cold wax, so it comes in little jars. And I work on paper. I work on a very robust paper, German paper. And actually, I started working on paper. I used to work on hardboard because it's. And I work large, and it's much easier to manoeuvre on paper. And so I put a layer of wax on the paper before I start, like a primer. It's an unusual process. I don't know what conservators would think about it. So I don't prime it. And then I start painting in oil paint, and I lay out the painting quite carefully, which is flat on the table. And I often put in layers of wax because, as I said earlier, I like capturing the traces of previous stages. And then about halfway through, I get it mounted, cold, dry mounted onto a double thickness mounting card. So it becomes very substantial and much more like an object. And at that stage, I put it on the easel. And so I start working vertically. And I start working then often in much broader brushes. So it's working in quite a lot of detail. And then I eliminate quite a lot of the detail. And then I always end up with a layer of wax.
Thank you. Sorry, Molly.
There indeed has been quite a bit of interest in the specifics of your process. So that was a perfectly timed question. There's also a lot of interest in your schooling, and you talk about this sort of crisis in painting at the time you were in art school. And there's a question about what other media were in vogue at that time, and questions about how your process and practice of figurative painting, if there's a connection there with your interest in personal narratives and in relation to the status of painting while you were in art school.
Right. There's sort of three questions there, really, aren't there? You might have to remind me of the last bit. I suppose in terms of my training and what was going on. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, the kind of abstract versus figurative was a huge kind of debate. And then in the sort of, later on, it became, it moved away from that into the use of much very different media, film, sound, all sorts of things. So painting for a very long period, I mean, it's changing now, was very much not fashionable. And I can't remember the rest of the question, sorry, we'll just tell me again.
There's a question asking about the connection between your practice as a figurative painter, although you just said at the end that you consider yourself an abstract painter committed to realism. But a question about whether there's a connection with that figurative painting and your deep interest in personal narratives, the oral history component to your works.
Yes, I think there is really. I mean, I suppose. I mean, in terms of the oral history and the narrative, the time spent during the portrait and the oral history is a very organic time, where I change through the accumulation of listening and acquiring and growing knowledge about the person and more familiarity. And what this life story recording somehow brings about a lot of rough sketches and drawings. So I think the narrative, there's my own narrative there, as well as the narrative that I'm actually listening to. And I was thinking about the question too. I was a very solitary child, so I was always drawing. And drawing and writing became very interlinked for me. And so I think I was illustrating my life, but I think that I was looking at things and documenting things.
Thank you again, Eileen and Elisabeth. I'm afraid we're out of time today, but please do join us for our next program in this Artists in Conversation series. On Friday, September 25th at 12 p.m. Eastern, we have artist Hugh Locke, who will be in conversation with Martina Droth, the Deputy Director of Research, Exhibitions and Publications and Curator of Sculpture at the Center. You'll find details about this and our other upcoming programs on our website. And thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Bye.